Welcome to Tales by Ada. In this edition of our story, we bring you a tale that has been passed down through generations. One filled with love, sacrifice, betrayal, and a fight for freedom. It's the story of Prince Onwa, a young royal prince born under a rare and mystical curse, burned by the moon. Onwa lives in the shadows. His every step were governed by the rules set by the goddess who gave him life. His parents, King Odumeje and Queen Sarah, desperate for an heir, they sought the help of a moon goddess, but the price was steep. Now, as Onwa grows, he finds himself trapped in a world of secrecy and sacrifice, with his future uncertain. When love enters his heart, he is forced to choose between the safety of the shadows and the dangerous allure of the sun. With a kingdom's fate at stake and a jealous adversary threatening everything, Onwa must break free from the chains that bind him. This is a story of a prince's journey to find freedom, the love that could save him, and the price he must pay to secure his legacy. I'm sure you know the kind of tale I'm talking about. One where destiny and love collides, and nothing is ever as it seems. So sit back, relax, and let me take you through this unforgettable journey. Don't forget to follow me and watch all parts of this story. The people of Enugu State were prosperous. They were known far and wide for their wealth in agriculture and trade. Their crops thrived under the fertile soil, and their cattle roamed freely in the pastures that stretched for miles. It was a kingdom of peace, wealth, and stability. A kingdom that seemed to have everything except one thing that truly mattered: a future. For King Odumeje, it was the greatest sorrow. The throne was secure, and his reign was marked by prosperity and just rule. But the thought that his name would not carry on through the generations were an unbearable weight upon his shoulders. His wife, Queen Sarah, was a woman of rare beauty and wisdom. Her kindness was a staff of legend. Yet, despite their love for one another, they had no children to carry on the bloodline. No heir to sit on the throne after them. It was a cruel irony. For all their riches, one thing they could not obtain was a son. The people of Enugu loved their queen, but whispers began to spread. Without a child, their future as a royal family was uncertain. They worried for the stability of the kingdom, the future of the people. But for Odumeje, it was more than that. This was not just about the throne. It was about his lineage, his name, his soul. His ancestors had ruled these lands for generations, and it was a fear he could not shake. What could become of his line if he passed without a son? Desperation grew in the king's heart. He called upon the kingdom's elders, seers, and healers to seek a solution. They came from distant land with their cryptic knowledge and rituals, but none could offer him any real hope. They spoke of offerings to the gods, ancient rites, and sacrifices, but they had no answer to the deep-rooted longings in King Odumeje's heart. His wife remained barren, and as the years passed, the king's hope faded, slowly turning into a bitterness he could not escape. One cold night, when the air was thick with a scent of impending rain and the moon hung like a pale garden in the sky, King Odumeje found himself walking alone through the palace grounds. His heart were heavy. The courtyard was usually filled with the sound of laughter and bustling servants. It was now silent. His footsteps echoed in the stillness as he wandered, feeling the cold night against his skin. His thoughts were consumed by one question: how could he ensure the survival of his legacy? That was when he heard it. He had a whisper, faint at first, but growing louder. It was not a voice, not a sound of any mortal making, but something more ancient, more profound. It was the voice of the moon goddess. King Odumeje, the voice called, gentle but commanding. It was a voice that seemed to come from everywhere, the trees, the wind, the very stars above. I have heard your cries. You seek a son to carry your name. Your desire has reached me, and I shall grant it, but at a cost. The king was startled at first. He dropped to his knees. His heart were pounding. His thoughts were spinning, but he knew once he had spoken to him. The moon goddess, the goddess of light, of fertility, of dreams. She was the one who held the powers to grant him the child he so desperately sought. I offer you a gift, King Odumeje, the voice continued. Your son will be born, but he will not be like any other man. He will be born of the spirit, and he will follow the laws of the moon. The sun will be his enemy, for it will drain his life and his strength. He must never eat anything that the sun touches. His clothes must not be dried under the sun. The water he drinks and bathes must be only fetched at night, after the sun has set. The king felt a shiver run through him as the weight of the goddess' word sank in. I will do anything, he whispered, his voice breaking. I will follow any rules. I will do whatever it takes to have a son. The moon goddess shimmered more brightly, as if passed by his sincerity. Then it shall be. You will have a son. His name will be Onwa, meaning the moon. He will carry your name, your bloodline, and your legacy. But remember this, don't break the rules. The sun must be his enemy forever, or else you will forfeit his life. With those final words, the goddess' presence faded, leaving the king alone in the dark, his heart filled with both awe and dread. He did not know the meaning of what the goddess had said, but he knew this: he had been granted a gift that would come with a heavy price. The following months were a whirlwind. The king and the queen, though still reeling from the strange promise made by them by the moon, followed their instructions to the letter. Queen Sarah later became pregnant with a child for the first time. They were both overjoyed and terrified. The rules were strict, and every detail of the prince's upbringing had to be followed meticulously. The maids, the servants, and even the royal doctors were given clear instructions to avoid the sun at all costs when caring for the child. They knew not to allow anything the sun had touched near the prince. The birth was a night of wonder. When Queen Sarah went into labor, the entire kingdom held its breath. It was a peaceful, serene night. As the moonlight poured into the royal chamber, the child was born. A boy, with a skin that seemed to glow under the light, eyes that reflected the stars, and a hair that was dark as the night sky itself. They immediately named him Onwa, as the goddess had decreed. The child was perfect in every way, except for one thing: the sun. From the moment he was born, he seemed to have a strange aversion to the light of the day. His skin will break into rashes if exposed to the sun, and his eyes will squint in pain whenever it touches his face. The king and the queen adhered to the goddess's rule, keeping Onwa in the shadows, allowing him to only see the world under the pale light of the moon. As Onwa grew, the kingdom marveled at his beauty and intelligence. His laughter echoed through the walls of the palace, and his bright eyes sparkled with curiosity. He was a gifted child, wise beyond his years, but there was always something unsettling about him, a sense that he was more than just a mortal child. The days following Prince Onwa's birth were a blur of celebration and quiet apprehensions. Enugu, the kingdom of abundance, held its breath as the royal couple, King Odumeje and Queen Sarah, began their life with their son. The kingdom rejoiced at his birth, their voices rising in jubilating songs, echoing through the valleys, across the rivers, and into the forest. Yet, behind the palace walls, a different story was unfolding, one of fear, tension, and strict obedience to the moon goddess' commands. The king and the queen held their son, but the price for the gift was steep. Every aspect of the prince's life had to be carefully managed to ensure his survival. No sunlight could touch him. No food or drink could be exposed to the sun's rays. The palace was constantly shrouded in shade. Windows were carefully covered. Curtains were drawn tightly to keep out any stray beams of sunlight that might harm the child. Queen Sarah, ever vigilant, would take Onwa into her arms every morning, feeling the soft, cool skin of her newborn son. She marveled at his features, the way his skin glowed under the moon's gentle light, his small hands that grasped hers with surprising strength. She whispered prayers into his tiny ears, prayers for his safety, for his strength, for his future. Yet there were a part of her heart that weighed heavy with doubt. She loved him dearly, but she wondered, what would become of him? How could he live a life so carefully controlled? As Onwa grew, so did the kingdom's selves of wonders and weariness. The people were curious about the prince, but no one was allowed to see him in the light of the day. Only after the sun had set, when the kingdom was bathed in the silver light of the moon, could they see the young prince. By the day, the palace guards guarded everywhere, save for occasional maids or servants who obeyed the rules by the king. They were careful to keep the boy indoors, and the maids were reminded time without number not to dry Onwa's clothes under the sun. The water he drank was fetched under the cover of the night, and his food was prepared under the shadows. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the prince, now an infant, was allowed to play in the palace courtyard under the protection of nightfall. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a soft silver light over the courtyard, and Onwa's laughter filled the air like the sound of tinkling bells. His small feet patted the cold stone floors as he crawled towards the soft grass that lay before him. His mother, standing just a few feet away, watched him with a mixture of love and concern. His movements were quick and graceful, a sharp contrast to his fragile state when the sun was out. In the moonlight he thrived, but in the daytime he was weak, his vitality drained as though the very warmth of the sun itself could rob him of his strength. Onwa, Queen Sarah whispered to herself, her voice barely audible, "You are the gift of the spirit, but I fear for you, my son. I fear what the world will do to you." She sighed deeply and turned away, her gaze falling to the royal gardens, their blooming flowers closed tight, keeping the beauty hidden from the sun. The gardens too were shielded by high walls, like the prince's existence, kept away from the brightness of the world, hidden in the shadows. As months passed, Prince Onwa grew into a curious young child. He was very inquisitive in nature, and it took him on an endless adventure in the darkened halls of the palace. He would wander through the corridors, his small hands brushing against the walls, feeling the cool stone under his fingertips. He would sit at his mother's feet, listening to the elders as they spoke of the kingdom's history, of the gods who once ruled the land, and of the ancestors who had built the very foundation of the kingdom. His minds were absorbed of every word, every story, as though they were being molded for a destiny greater than he could comprehend. But as his mind expanded, the weight of the moon goddess's rule began to hang over him, a constant reminder of his difference. It was on one of these quiet nights, when the air was cool and the moon hung high, that the first sign of Onwa's true power began to show. The royal court had gathered for a feast, as they often did to celebrate the prince's milestones. This night was special. Onwa was to take his first step in the moonlight. The entire palace had been adorned with silver decorations, and the maid had laid out the fine linens for the royal tables. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meats, fruits, and fine wines. Yet, all of it was prepared in the dark. The prince's first step was a ceremonial movement, a marker of his growth, and the king and the queen could not have been prouder. Onwa was supported by his mother. He stood before the court. The faces of the courtiers were all lit by the soft glows of lanterns, and their eyes were sparkled with anticipation. Queen Sarah held his hand. Her voice was low with encouragement. "You can do it, Onwa," she whispered, her eyes beaming with tears. "Take your first step into the world." With a deep breath, the prince took a very shaky step forward, then another. The courtiers gasped in unison, marveling at the strength and grace the prince displayed. His small feet moved with purpose. His eyes were fixed on his parents as he took slow, careful steps. The moonlight caught his face, and his skin shimmered as though being touched by the stars themselves. The kingdom's heart swelled with pride as they witnessed this miraculous moment. The prince, their heir, was growing into a strong man. Yet, as Onwa stepped forward, he caught a sight of something that caused him to hesitate. It was the sun's ray, which had begun to creep into the horizon, creeping into the room where they sat. The bright light slowly made its way towards Onwa, its warmth threatening to touch him. His face was scorched in pains, and the sight of the sun's rays, even in the slightest measure, caused his body to react violently. His skin began to redden, and his eyes squinted in agony. And without thinking, Onwa turned, retreating into the shadows, his small feet moving swiftly towards the curtains, where the cool darkness of the night awaited him. The room felt silent as the courtiers watched in shock. Queen Sarah gasped, her heart was sinking. "My son," she whispered, rushing to his side. "You must never come into contact with the sun. It will hurt you, Onwa." The king stepped forward, with his face a mask of concern. "The moon goddess rules are scared," he said solemnly. "You must never forget them, Onwa. The sun is not your friend. You will live in its shadow for your own protection." The prince, his face was pale from the pain of the sun's touch, nodded quietly. He had learned a harsh lesson that night, one that would follow him for the rest of his life. The moon was his protector, and it was the only light that he could embrace. As the months turned into years, Onwa's life became a delicate dance between the moon and the sun. He lived in the shadows, avoiding the sun's touch, with a fever that burdened with obsession. The maids, now loyal and protective, kept him away from any danger, ensuring that the prince's clothes never saw daylight, and that his meals were prepared in the cool hours of the evening. But as Onwa grew older, a new challenge began to emerge, one that would test him in ways he had never anticipated. The prince, now entering his adolescence, began to feel a stirring of something deeper inside of him, a longing for something more. He felt the strange of love, and he longed for the companionship of someone who could understand him, someone who could see beyond the shadows of his life and love him for who he was. And so, as the fate would have it, Onwa's heart would lead him towards someone who would change his life forever. As Prince Onwa entered his teenage years, he began to grow into his own person. He was shaped not only by the love of his parents, but also the burden of the moon goddess's rules. His life was, though protected by the night and hidden from the harsh rays of the sun, felt like a delicate balance, one he was constantly aware of. He would spend his days in the safety of the palace, reading scrolls of the ancient knowledge, learning from the elders, and wandering in the gardens at twilight. The moonlight was his constant companion. and with each passing day, he grew stronger, both in the mind and the spirit. Despite the restrictions that governed his life, Onwa's world was not without beauty. The night under the gaze of the stars held a magic of their own. The moonlight bathed the palace in a serene glow, casting long shadows that made the world feel timeless. Onwa spent many evenings in the royal gardens, which, despite being kept in the shadows, was one of the most beautiful places in the kingdom. The fragrant flowers, blooming in the moon's soft light, seemed to echo in the prince's own glowing desires. But there was something else in the garden that lingered, something that Onwa could not ignore. An unspoken connection he had in his early childhood. It was a bond that neither he or she could fully understand at first, but with time, it blossomed into something undeniable. Her name was Caro. Caro was the daughter of one of the chief palace maids. She had spent her childhood in the palace, growing up alongside Prince Onwa. While she was not of noble blood, she had always been a constant presence in Onwa's life, though she had never been treated as anything more than a servant. Her mother, Nkechi's mother, had been one of the closest confidants of Queen Sarah and Caro. In turn, had spent many hours in the royal chambers, playing with Onwa, as they were both small children, laughing and running through the gardens together. From the very beginning, Caro had been enchanted by the prince, not because of his royal blood, but because of his heart. Onwa, unlike others of his rank, had never looked down upon her. They had spent hours together, speaking of everything and nothing, sharing their thoughts in quiet corners of the palace. And as they grew older, Onwa began to notice her in a different way. He saw her beauty, the way her laughter filled the empty spaces in his heart. Her presence had become something he could imagine without. But their bond, innocent as it seemed, was not without its complications. Caro had grown into a striking young woman with dark eyes that sparkled with her life. Her skin was glowing into the soft moonlight, and her hair was cascaded down her back like a waterfall of midnight. She had matured into someone that Onwa could no longer view simply as a childhood companion. He had fallen deeply in love with her, and he no longer felt he need to hide it. The problem now is, however, their love was forbidden. The rules were clear. Onwa could not have anything that the sun touched. No relationship, no commitment, nothing that could lead to exposure. Yet, every time he saw Caro, his heart seemed to beat faster, as if his soul knew that he had found his true love. His love for her was not just about her body. It was a deep connection of the spirit. The moon had brought them together, but it was love that kept them close. Caro too had begun to feel the same shift. She too saw Onwa differently now. No longer just a prince to her. He had become her confidant, her friend, and soon the man she loved. But as much as she yearned to express this, she knew the dangers it posed. She had heard whispers from the other palace servants, warnings about the prince's condition. She knew that even the moment in the sunlight could mean his death. This knowledge only deepened her feelings of fear and love for him. What kind of life could they have together if they were forced to hide in the shadows? But their love was not only a thing stringing in the palace. There was another woman in the kingdom who had spent years quietly watching the prince, wishing for the affection that Caro had found so easily. She was Nkechi, the daughter of the chief palace maid, a woman who had been a part of the royal household for as long as she could remember. Though her position was humble, she had always believed that Onwa was meant for her. She had spent her childhood with him as well. After all, she had been cared for him in ways that no one else. But unlike Caro, Nkechi's love had twisted into something darker, something fueled by jealousy and resentment. As a child, Nkechi had loved Onwa, but when she saw Karo's growing closeness with him, something inside her shifted. The pure affection she had once felt for him now soared into something much more dangerous. She could not stand to see another woman, especially someone of a low status, take what she had felt was rightfully hers. She had watched as Onwa and Karo spent more time together, their laughter ringing through the palace halls. She had watched as Karo's soft, melodic voice and gentle touch captured Onwa's heart. And with each passing day, Nkechi's bitterness grew. Her jealousy festered, and as soon as she could, consumed by her thought. She could no longer watch Onwa and Karo together without feeling an intense rage that she could no longer contain. She hated Karo's innocence. The way the prince looked at her with such tenderness, she now hated how Karo had something she could never have. One day, in a quiet moment of frustration, Nkechi confronted Karo in the garden. The evening was just the beginning of the night, and the moon was high in the sky, casting a pale glow over the flowers. Karo had been picking herbs for the kitchen, her fingers moving delicately through the plant. When she felt a presence behind her, she turned to see Nkechi standing there. Her expression were cold and unreadable. "Do you think he will love you forever, Karo?" Nkechi's voice was sharp, cutting through the stillness. "Do you think the prince will choose you? You that is a mere servant's daughter, over someone of his own rank, someone who belongs with him." Karo stood still. Her heart were hammering in her chest. She had always known that Nkechi harbored feelings for the prince, but she had never imagined that it would come to this, an outright confrontation. "Nkechi," Karo said softly, trying to keep her voice steadily. "I never sought his love. I never asked for this. It's not something I can control." "Control?" Nkechi scoffed, stepping closer. "You have no idea what you are dealing with. You think this is some innocent childhood crush, don't you? But you are playing with fire, Karo. You don't understand the dangers you are in. You don't know how fragile his life is. One wrong move and he is gone." Karo's breath caught in her throat. She had always feared this. Nkechi's jealousy and resentment had now been shimmering for years, and now it was bubbling over into something dangerous. She could feel the heat in the air, the tension between them, and if the very ground beneath them might crack open at any moment. "I love him," Karo whispered. Her voice was filled with quiet resolve. "And he loves me too. You can't change that, Nkechi. You can't take it away from me." Nkechi's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a cold, knowing smile. "We'll see about that, won't we, Karo?" she hissed before turning and disappearing into the shadows of the night. The days following Nkechi's confrontation with Karo weighed heavily on both women, though in different ways. Karo continued to nurture her bond with Prince Onwa. She couldn't help the deepening affection she felt for him, nor could she ignore the quiet hope that despite the many obstacles in her way, their love would eventually flourish. In the moonlit hours, they would meet in the royal gardens. Their conversations were often lingering, long into the night. They spoke of their dreams, their fears, and the possibility of a life together, beyond the constraints of the palace walls. Onwa, though burdened by his condition, was filled with a sense of quiet peace when Karo was near. But even in the safety of their shared moment, they both knew the unspoken truth. Nothing about their love was simple. Each step they took towards one another was laden with invisible chains. The moonlight, though soft, guiding their presence, also served as a reminder of the dangers that lurked in the daylight. Onwa's heart longed for a world beyond the shadows, yet he knew that his life would always be confined in the night. It was in one of these quiet moments, when Onwa and Karo were sitting in the palace fountain, that the prince finally spoke words that he has been building in his heart. "Karo, Onwa began. His voice was gentle. I want to marry you. I know that I cannot live like this forever, hiding in the shadows. I want to live in the light, with you by my side. But I also know the dangers it would bring. I could never ask you to live in fear with me. The world we dream of, where we can walk under the sun, it seems so far away. I don't know what to do. Carol turned to him. Her heart was filled with a mixture of love and sorrow. She reached out and took his hands. Her fingers were soft and sure against her skin. Onwa, she said softly, I've always known this love would come to these trials, but my heart cannot be torn from you. If the sun is our enemy, then we shall live in the shadows, where we are safe. I will never leave you, Onwa. But as Carol spoke, her heart too was clouded with doubt. She was deeply in love with Onwa, but the life they both dreamed of, a life in the sun, a life where their love could be open and unburdened by the shadows, seemed very impossible. Would they always have to hide? Would they ever truly be free? As Carol's thoughts swelled, another presence quietly watching them from afar, Nkechi, hidden behind the pillar of the garden, had overheard their conversation. Her heart twisted in pains as she listened to their words. With each sentence, her jealousy grew. She could not bear to see Onwa and Carol together, their love blooming like a flower in the night. But to Nkechi, it was a flower she had spent years trying to destroy. How could Carol, a mere servant's daughter, steal what was rightfully hers? The pain of it all burdened inside her, and she vowed that she would not let their happiness continue. If she could not have Onwa, then no one else could. The following days were filled with a tense quietness, as if the palace itself was holding its breath. Carol and Onwa continued to meet in the gardens, their moments together still as precious as they were, though the weight of their secret love grew heavier with each passing day. The palace maids, ever vigilant, whispered among themselves, knowing that something was brewing, something that could shatter the fragile peace they had come to cherish. Meanwhile, Nkechi, consumed by bitterness and jealousy, began to form a plan. She knew that the prince's love for Carol was something she could never change. Not directly, but there was one thing she could do. One way she could remove Carol from Onwa's life forever. It was a way that had been done before, a way that would make the prince pay the price for loving another woman who was beneath him. Nkechi has heard the whispers among the palace servants about the prince's fragile condition, how even the smallest exposure to the sun could lead to his death. She knew the risk Onwa faced more than anyone, and she also knew that the water that was fetched each night to nurture the prince, he drank only waters that were fetched in the midnight. And so Nkechi decided to do what her jealous heart had long desired. She would change the water. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Nkechi ordered one of the servants to fetch water from the palace fountain. But she had a plan. Instead of her to wait until the cooling nightfall, when the water was pure and untouched, she sent the servants to fetch it in the sweltering afternoon, when the sun was at its peak. She knew that the sun's ray would touch the water, and it would carry the warmth of the day, something that Onwa's delicate body could not endure. She smiled bitterly to herself as the servants returned with the water. She knew exactly what she had done, and in that moment, she felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. If she could not have Onwa, she would make sure that no one else did. Carol would be forced to live the prince's life, and Onwa would no longer be a threat to her. With a final glance at the water, Nkechi handed it to the waiting servant and instructed them to deliver it to Onwa's chamber.